The morning of October 15th, 2013, began like any other Tuesday in the small town of Cedar Falls, Iowa. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and the promise of an early winter, while school buses rumbled down Main Street collecting children bundled in their first heavy jackets of the season. At 847 Maple Avenue, 7-year-old Emma Rodriguez sat at the kitchen table, carefully spreading strawberry jam on her toast, while her grandmother, Maria, packed her lunch with the same methodical care she had shown every school day for the past 2 years. Emma had been living with Maria since her mother, Isabella, had struggled through a difficult period following her divorce. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, just until Isabella could get back on her feet, find stable work, and secure a proper apartment. But temporary had stretched into something more permanent, and both Maria and Emma had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Maria would wake at 6, prepare breakfast, walk Emma the 4 blocks to Cedar Falls Elementary, then return home to tend her small garden before heading to her afternoon shift at the local diner. "Mija, don't forget your sweater," Maria said, speaking in the gentle mixture of English and Spanish that had become their private language. "Mrs. Patterson says it gets cold in the classroom after lunch." Emma nodded, though her attention was focused on the small birthmark on her left wrist, a distinctive mark, shaped like a crescent moon, that she often traced with her finger when she was thinking. It was a habit that amused Maria, who would tell her it was a sign that she was destined for something special. The walk to school that morning was unremarkable. They passed the same houses they had walked by hundreds of times before, the Blue Victorian where old Mr. Chen tended his prize-winning roses, the corner store where Emma sometimes got candy after school, the park where she and Maria would feed the ducks on weekends. Emma chatted about her upcoming spelling test and her best friend Sarah's birthday party, while Maria listened with the patient attention of someone who understood that these small conversations were the building blocks of a child's sense of security. At the school gates, Maria kissed Emma's forehead and reminded her to wait by the flagpole after school, the same reminder she gave every day, though Emma had never forgotten. "I'll be here at 3:15, just like always," Maria said, adjusting Emma's backpack straps. Emma waved goodbye and disappeared through the doors of Cedar Falls Elementary, her small figure quickly swallowed by the stream of children heading to their classrooms. Maria returned home and spent the morning as she always did, tending to her tomato plants, now heavy with the last harvest of the season, and preparing for her shift at Murphy's Diner. She had worked there for 15 years, serving coffee and homemade pie to the same familiar faces, people who had become less like customers and more like extended family. The work was steady, if not particularly well paid, and it allowed her the flexibility to care for Emma, something that had become the central purpose of her life since her granddaughter had come to live with her. At 3 o'clock, Maria closed the diner's register, hung up her apron and walked the familiar route to the school. Other grandparents and parents were already gathering by the flagpole, a small community of caregivers who had formed loose friendships over shared pickup duties and concerns about homework and growing children. Maria took her usual spot and waited, watching the doors for Emma's distinctive purple backpack and the way she always skipped the last 3 steps down from the main entrance. 3:15 came and went. Maria checked her watch, an old Timex that had belonged to her late husband, and reassured herself that teachers sometimes ran late, that children sometimes lingered to finish projects or chat with friends. By 3:30, most of the other children had emerged, running toward waiting cars and familiar faces. The crowd of parents began to thin, but there was still no sign of Emma. By 3:45, Maria's casual concern had transformed into something sharper, more urgent. She approached Mrs. Patterson, Emma's second-grade teacher, who was escorting the last few students to the pickup area. "Excuse me," Maria said, her voice carefully controlled. "I'm here for Emma Rodriguez." She should have been out by now. Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted from polite recognition to confusion, then to something that made Maria's stomach clench with sudden fear. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said slowly, "Emma wasn't in class today. We marked her absent this morning when she didn't show up for attendance." The words seemed to echo in the afternoon air, gaining weight and meaning as they settled. Maria felt the world tilt slightly, as if the familiar landscape of her daily routine had suddenly become foreign territory. "That's impossible," she said, though even as she spoke, she knew that impossible things happened every day, that the thin line between ordinary Tuesday and unthinkable tragedy could be crossed in the space of a single moment. "I walked her to school this morning," Maria continued, her voice rising slightly. "I watched her go through those doors. She was wearing her red sweater with the little flowers, and she had her purple backpack. The details felt important, as if their specificity could somehow restore the natural order of things, could bring Emma back to the place where she was supposed to be." Mrs. Patterson's face had gone pale. She was young, perhaps 25, and this was only her second year teaching. Nothing in her education had prepared her for this moment, for the sight of a grandmother, slowly realizing that her granddaughter had vanished somewhere between the school gates and the classroom door. "Let me check with the office," she said, though they both knew that the office would have no better explanation, no simple clerical error that could account for a 7-year-old girl who had walked through the front doors of an elementary school and then simply disappeared. What followed was a blur of activity that would be replayed in Maria's memory countless times over the coming years. Phone calls to the principal, to the school district's security office, to the Cedar Falls Police Department. A search of the school building that revealed nothing. No sign that Emma had ever entered the hallways or the classroom where her desk sat empty, her name tag still carefully printed in Mrs. Patterson's neat handwriting. The police arrived within 20 minutes. First a patrol car, then a detective, then more officers and specialists whose presence transformed the quiet school grounds into something that resembled the crime scenes Maria had seen on television, but never imagined would intersect with her own life. They asked questions with professional gentleness. When had she last seen Emma? What was she wearing? Did she have any history of wandering off? Were there any family disputes or custody issues that might be relevant? Maria answered as best she could, though the questions seemed to come from very far away, filtered through a growing sense of unreality. Yes, Emma had been acting normally that morning. No, she had never disappeared before. No, there were no custody disputes. Emma's father lived in California and had minimal contact with his daughter. Isabella was in Chicago working at a hotel and trying to save money for an apartment, calling every few days, but struggling with her own demons. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, the search expanded. Officers walked the route between Maria's house and the school, knocked on doors, spoke to neighbors who might have seen something unusual. The local news arrived, setting up cameras and asking for interviews that Maria was not yet ready to give. Cedar Falls was a small town where serious crimes were rare, where children walked to school and people left their doors unlocked. Emma's disappearance felt like a violation of something fundamental, a crack in the foundation of community trust. By nightfall, Emma Rodriguez had become a statistic, a case number, a missing child whose photograph would soon appear on flyers and websites and milk cartons. But for Maria, sitting in her too-quiet house and staring at the strawberry jam still on the kitchen counter, Emma remained what she had always been, a little girl who traced the crescent-shaped birthmark on her wrist when she was thinking, who loved stories about princesses and worried about spelling tests, who had walked out of her grandmother's sight and into a mystery that would haunt Cedar Falls for years to come. The last Tuesday of Emma's childhood had become the first day of her disappearance. and Maria Rodriguez would spend the next 8 years waiting by a different kind of door, hoping for news that seemed less likely with each passing season. The days following Emma's disappearance blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights, endless phone calls, and the steady accumulation of procedures that transform a missing child from a person into a case. Maria's small house on Maple Avenue became the unofficial headquarters for a search effort that would eventually involve hundreds of volunteers, multiple law enforcement agencies, and a media attention that felt both necessary and invasive. Detective Sarah Chen, a 15-year veteran of the Cedar Falls Police Department, had handled missing persons cases before, but never one involving a child this young who had vanished in broad daylight from what should have been a secure location. She was a methodical investigator, known for her ability to remain calm under pressure, and her talent for getting people to trust her with their most painful truths. Within hours of taking the case, she had established the timeline that would become the framework for everything that followed. According to Maria's statement, Emma had left the house at 8:35 a.m., walking the familiar 4-block route to Cedar Falls Elementary. The school's security cameras, old and poorly maintained, showed nothing useful. The main entrance was barely visible in the grainy footage, and none of the cameras captured the moment when Emma should have entered the building. Mrs. Patterson had marked Emma absent at 9:15 a.m., following standard protocol, but had not immediately contacted Maria because children were sometimes late due to doctor's appointments or family emergencies that parents forgot to report. Detective Chen interviewed every staff member who had been on duty that morning. The principal, a man nearing retirement who had known 3 generations of Cedar Falls families, was devastated by the thought that a child had disappeared on school grounds. The secretary, who controlled access to the building through a buzzer system, remembered several parent visits that morning, but nothing unusual. The custodian, who had been cleaning hallways when school started, had seen nothing that raised any red flags. The search expanded beyond the school to encompass the entire route Emma would have taken. Officers knocked on every door, spoke to every resident, collected security footage from the handful of businesses that had cameras facing the street. A few witnesses remembered seeing a small girl in a red sweater that morning, but their accounts were vague and didn't provide any new leads. One elderly man thought he had seen Emma talking to someone near the park, but when pressed for details, he admitted his memory wasn't reliable. Within 48 hours, the FBI had been called in to assist with the investigation. Agent Michael Torres, who specialized in crimes against children, arrived from the Des Moines field office with a team of specialists and resources that dwarfed anything the local police department could provide. He was a soft-spoken man in his 40s, a father himself, who understood that the success of child abduction cases often depended on the first few days of investigation. The Amber Alert that went out across Iowa and neighboring states included Emma's school photo, a smiling 7-year-old with dark hair pulled back in pigtails, wearing the kind of dress-up clothes that children choose for picture day. The description mentioned her red sweater, her purple backpack, and the distinctive crescent-shaped birthmark on her left wrist. Within hours, tip lines were flooded with calls from people who thought they had seen her, but each lead was carefully investigated and ultimately ruled out. Isabella Rodriguez arrived from Chicago on the second day, her face etched with a grief that seemed to age her years in the span of hours. She was 28 years old, a woman who had struggled with depression and financial instability since her divorce, but who loved her daughter with a fierce intensity that no one who met her could doubt. The reunion with her mother was painful to witness, 2 women clinging to each other while trying to navigate guilt, fear, and a growing sense that their world had been permanently altered. The media attention was both a blessing and a curse. Local television stations ran Emma's story every night, keeping her disappearance in the public consciousness, but also bringing unwanted scrutiny to a family that was already struggling to cope. Reporters camped outside Maria's house, asking for interviews and updates that the family wasn't ready to provide. Well-meaning neighbors brought casseroles and offered help, but the constant stream of visitors made privacy impossible. Search parties formed organically, led by community members who felt compelled to do something, anything, that might help bring Emma home. They combed through wooded areas outside town, checked abandoned buildings, walked along the Cedar River with the kind of systematic thoroughness that spoke to both hope and desperation. Maria joined these searches whenever the police allowed it, walking through tall grass and calling Emma's name until her voice was hoarse, looking for any sign that her granddaughter had passed through these places. The investigation revealed no evidence of family dysfunction or custody disputes that might explain Emma's disappearance. Isabella's ex-husband, living in Los Angeles, had a solid alibi and showed genuine shock when contacted by authorities. There were no registered sex offenders living in the immediate area, no recent reports of suspicious activity around the school. Emma seemed to have simply vanished, leaving behind no trace except for the growing certainty that something terrible had happened to a child who had never been anything but loved and protected. As weeks turned into months, the intensive daily searches gave way to a more sustained but less visible investigation. Detective Chen continued to follow leads, interview potential witnesses, and coordinate with other agencies, but the case began to take on the characteristics of the unsolved mysteries that haunt small communities for decades. Emma's school desk remained empty, a daily reminder to her classmates and teachers that some questions don't have answers, that safety is more fragile than anyone wants to believe. The first anniversary of Emma's disappearance was marked by a candlelight vigil in the park, where she used to feed ducks with her grandmother. Hundreds of people gathered to remember a little girl most of them had never met, but who had become a symbol of every parent's worst nightmare. Maria spoke briefly, her voice steady despite the tears, asking people to continue hoping, to keep looking, to remember that Emma was more than just a missing child. She was a person who loved strawberry jam and worried about spelling tests and had dreams that deserved to be fulfilled. If stories like Emma's remind you that even in our darkest moments, hope continues to flicker like a candle that refuses to be extinguished, we share them because they honor the missing and the searching alike. Subscribe to hear more stories that acknowledge both the darkness and the light that exist side by side in the human experience. Detective Chen kept Emma's case file on her desk, adding new information whenever it became available, but the leads grew increasingly sparse. The FBI maintained Emma on their database of missing children, but the active investigation gradually wound down as other cases demanded attention and resources. Maria returned to work at the diner, though her colleagues noticed that she never quite seemed fully present, as if part of her remained frozen in that moment when she realized her granddaughter wasn't coming out of the school doors. Isabella eventually returned to Chicago, unable to bear the daily reminders of Cedar Falls, but also unable to move forward with her life. She called her mother every day, asking if there had been any news, any developments, any reason to hope that Emma might still be found. The conversations were brief and painful, filled with the weight of questions that had no answers and a love that had nowhere to go. As the months stretched toward the first year, Emma Rodriguez had become both everywhere and nowhere. Her image on missing child posters in truck stops and grocery stores across the Midwest. Her story told and retold in media accounts that gradually moved from front pages to inside sections, to archives that only the most determined researchers would ever find. But in Cedar Falls, in the heart of a grandmother who had raised her and loved her, Emma remained as real and present as she had been on that last Tuesday morning when she traced her birthmark with her finger, and promised to wait by the flagpole at 3:15. Time moved differently in Cedar Falls after Emma's disappearance. The seasons changed with their familiar rhythm. Autumn leaves gave way to winter snow, which melted into spring rain and summer heat. But underneath the surface patterns of small-town life, something fundamental had shifted. Emma's absence became a permanent presence, a shadow that touched every school event, every child's birthday party, every moment when parents watched their children walk away and wondered if they would come home. Maria Rodriguez aged in ways that couldn't be measured simply by the passage of years. Her hair, which had been salt and pepper when Emma lived with her, turned completely white. The lines around her eyes deepened, carved by sleepless nights and the constant strain of hoping for news that never came. She continued working at Murphy's Diner, serving coffee and pie to customers who had learned not to ask about the investigation unless she brought it up first. Her regulars understood that some grief was too deep for casual conversation, too raw for the comfortable distance that small talk provided. The diner became an informal gathering place for people who remembered Emma, who had participated in the searches, who still wondered what had happened to the little girl with the crescent-shaped birthmark. Coffee conversations often drifted toward theories and possibilities, the kind of speculation that fills the space left by unanswered questions. Some believed Emma had been taken by a stranger passing through town. Others wondered if she had wandered off and gotten lost, though extensive searches had found no trace of her. A few held on to the hope that she was alive somewhere, living under a different name, growing up in circumstances that no one wanted to imagine. Detective Chen, now promoted to lieutenant, kept Emma's case active, even as department priorities shifted to more recent crimes. She had developed a reputation as someone who didn't give up easily, who understood that cold cases were only cold until new information brought them back to life. Every few months, she would review Emma's file, looking for connections she might have missed, following up on tips that continued to trickle in from across the country. The work was often frustrating, but she had made a promise to Maria Rodriguez and to Emma herself that she wouldn't stop looking. The investigation had expanded and contracted over the years, following leads that sometimes took detectives to other states, other missing children cases, other families dealing with the particular agony of not knowing. Emma's DNA profile was entered into national databases. Her dental records were updated based on projections of normal growth. Her age-progressed photographs were distributed annually to show what she might look like as she grew older. These images were both hopeful and haunting, the face of a child who might have been, growing up in circumstances that remained unknown. Isabella's life had taken on a nomadic quality that worried her mother. She had moved from Chicago to Denver, then to Portland, always looking for places where she could start over, where Emma's absence wouldn't be a daily reminder of what she had lost. But geography couldn't provide the distance she needed from her grief. She worked a series of hotel jobs, sending money home to her mother when she could, calling every week to ask if there had been any developments. The conversations were ritual more than communication, a way of maintaining connection across the miles and the years. Cedar Falls Elementary had created a small memorial garden where Emma's classmates could go to remember their friend who had never returned from that Tuesday morning. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had stayed in education but had moved to a different district, unable to walk past Emma's empty desk every day without feeling the weight of questions she couldn't answer. The children who had been in second grade with Emma were now in high school, but some of them still remembered the girl who had traced her birthmark when she was thinking, who had worried about spelling tests and loved stories about princesses. The media attention that had once focused intensely on Emma's case had gradually shifted to newer tragedies, more recent disappearances. But true crime podcasters and online investigators had discovered her story, adding Emma's case to the growing catalogue of unsolved mysteries that attracted amateur detectives and conspiracy theorists. Some of this attention was helpful, generating new tips and keeping Emma's story in the public consciousness. Other aspects were intrusive and painful, turning a family's private tragedy into entertainment for people who had never known Emma as anything more than a photograph and a set of facts. Maria had learned to navigate this landscape of unwanted attention and well-meaning but misguided help. She participated in interviews when she thought they might genuinely help find Emma, but she had also learned to protect herself from people who wanted to exploit her grief for their own purposes. The balance was delicate and exhausting, requiring her to constantly evaluate whether engaging with media or investigators might bring her granddaughter home or simply add to the noise that surrounded missing children cases. The house on Maple Avenue remained largely unchanged from the day Emma had disappeared. Her bedroom was exactly as she had left it, down to the stuffed animals arranged on the bed and the drawing of a unicorn taped to the wall. Maria cleaned the room every week, dusting furniture that no one used, washing sheets that no one slept in, maintaining a space for a girl who might never return, but who deserved to have a home waiting for her. Neighbors sometimes suggested that keeping the room unchanged wasn't healthy, but Maria understood something they didn't. Hope required concrete expressions, physical spaces where love could continue to exist even in the absence of its object. The anniversary of Emma's disappearance became an unofficial day of remembrance in Cedar Falls. People would leave flowers at the memorial garden, light candles in their windows, share memories and prayers on social media. These gestures were small but meaningful, ways of insisting that Emma Rodriguez had mattered, that her disappearance had left a hole in the community that couldn't be filled by simply moving on. Maria always attended these remembrances, though they were both comforting and painful. Reminders that Emma was loved by people who had never met her, but also acknowledgements that she remained missing. As the years accumulated, the investigation began to focus more on possibilities than active leads. Detective Chen worked with psychologists and criminologists to develop profiles of what might have happened to Emma, where she might be if she was still alive, what kind of person might have taken her. These exercises were speculative but necessary, ways of keeping the case alive in the absence of concrete evidence. They also represented a kind of faith, the belief that somewhere in the accumulation of theories and profiles and possibilities, there might be a key that would unlock the mystery of what had happened on that October morning. The 8th anniversary of Emma's disappearance fell on a Tuesday, just like the original day she had vanished. Maria woke early, as she always did, and prepared breakfast for one person instead of two. The routine had become automatic, but it still carried the weight of memory, the ghost of a little girl who used to spread strawberry jam on her toast while asking questions about spelling tests and birthday parties. Outside, Cedar Falls was going about its morning business, school buses rumbling down Main Street, children bundled in fall jackets, parents walking their kids to the same elementary school where Emma had vanished 8 years earlier. But 250 miles away in a hospital in Minneapolis, someone was about to notice something that would change everything. St. Mary's Medical Center in Minneapolis had seen its share of difficult cases over the years, but the girl who arrived in the emergency department on a cold November morning seemed to carry more than her share of invisible wounds. She appeared to be around 15 years old, though malnutrition made it difficult to determine her exact age. Her clothes were ill-fitting and dirty, her hair matted, and her eyes held the kind of wariness that comes from years of learning that adults could not be trusted. The girl had been brought in by social services after being found during a raid on a house in a run-down neighborhood where neighbors had complained about strange comings and goings, about children who were rarely seen but sometimes heard crying. The details were still being sorted out by police and child protective services, but it was clear that whatever had been happening in that house, it had left lasting damage on the young people who had been living there. Nurse Jennifer Walsh had been working pediatric emergency care for 12 years, long enough to recognize the signs of prolonged abuse and neglect. The girl sat hunched on the examination table, her arms wrapped around herself, flinching whenever anyone moved too quickly or spoke too loudly. She had given her name as Lily, but had been unable or unwilling to provide a last name, a birth date, or any information about her family. Social workers suspected she was one of several children who had been held in conditions that resembled captivity more than any conventional understanding of childhood. The intake process was slow and careful, designed to be as non-threatening as possible to a child who had clearly learned to fear medical procedures and adult authority. Jennifer took the girl's vital signs, noting the evidence of old injuries that had healed improperly, the signs of chronic stress and inadequate nutrition. But it was when she was documenting identifying marks for the medical record that she noticed something that made her pause and look more carefully. On the girl's left wrist was a distinctive birthmark shaped like a crescent moon. It was clearly visible despite the dirt and grime, a mark that looked exactly like something Jennifer had seen hundreds of times over the years, not in person, but in the missing child flyers that were regularly circulated to hospitals, police stations, and social service agencies throughout the Midwest. The birthmark was so distinctive, so precisely shaped, that it was hard to believe it could be a coincidence. Jennifer excused herself from the examination room and went to the nursing station, where she pulled up the database of missing children that all medical facilities were required to maintain. She scrolled through pages of photographs and descriptions, looking for the image that she was certain she had seen. It took several minutes, but finally she found it. Emma Rodriguez, missing from Cedar Falls, Iowa since October 15, 2013. Age 7 at the time of disappearance, now approximately 15 years old. Distinguishing characteristics: crescent-shaped birthmark on left wrist. The photograph showed a smiling little girl with dark hair and bright eyes, wearing the kind of dress-up clothes that children choose for school pictures. The face was different from the girl sitting in the examination room, older, thinner, marked by experiences that no child should have to endure. But the birthmark was identical, down to the precise curve and size that made it as unique as a fingerprint. Jennifer's hands were shaking as she printed out Emma's missing child report and compared it to the girl in the examination room. The more she looked, the more convinced she became that this was the same person. The bone structure was similar, the shape of the eyes, the way she held her head when she was listening. 8 years of captivity and abuse had changed everything about this child, except for the crescent-shaped mark that had identified her as Emma Rodriguez when she was 7 years old. The protocol for potential missing child identifications was clear, but Jennifer had never had occasion to use it before. She notified her supervisor, who immediately contacted the Minneapolis Police Department and the FBI. Within an hour, the hospital was swarming with investigators, social workers, and specialists trained in dealing with recovered children who had been missing for extended periods. The girl who called herself Lily was moved to a secure room where she could be protected from media attention while the careful process of verification began. Detective Maria Santos of the Minneapolis Police Department had worked child exploitation cases for most of her career, but she had never been involved in the recovery of a child who had been missing for 8 years. The protocol was complex and delicate, requiring coordination between multiple agencies and jurisdictions. The first priority was medical care and safety, ensuring that the girl was healthy and protected from further harm. The second was verification, using DNA testing and other forensic methods to confirm her identity. The third was investigation, determining what had happened to her during the years she had been missing and ensuring that anyone responsible for her captivity was held accountable. The girl was clearly traumatized, speaking in whispers when she spoke at all, startling at unexpected sounds or movements. She had been conditioned to fear authority figures, to expect punishment for speaking out of turn or asking questions. The team of psychologists and social workers who were brought in to work with her understood that recovering her physical health would be only the beginning of a much longer process of healing psychological wounds that had been years in the making. Meanwhile, 250 miles away in Cedar Falls, Detective Chen received a phone call that she had been hoping for and dreading in equal measure for 8 years. The FBI agent on the other end of the line was careful to emphasize that nothing had been confirmed yet, that DNA testing would take time, that there were protocols that had to be followed. But a teenage girl had been found in Minneapolis with a birthmark that matched Emma Rodriguez's description exactly, and the timeline was consistent with someone who had been missing since 2013. The call to Maria Rodriguez was the most difficult conversation Detective Chen had ever had to make. How do you tell a grandmother that her missing granddaughter might have been found, but that the child who disappeared at age 7 had spent 8 years in circumstances that were still being investigated? How do you balance hope with the reality that recovery from long-term captivity was often as traumatic as the captivity itself? Maria's response was immediate and fierce. She needed to get to Minneapolis as soon as possible to see for herself whether this girl was her Emma. Detective Chen agreed to drive her, understanding that this was a moment that required personal support rather than official protocol. The 3-hour drive passed in relative silence, both women lost in their own thoughts about what they might find, what kind of reunion this might be after 8 years of separation and trauma. At St. Mary's Medical Center, preparations were being made for a meeting that would require extraordinary sensitivity and care. The girl who might be Emma Rodriguez had been told that someone was coming to see her, someone who might be her family, but she showed no recognition of the name or any excitement about the possibility of reunion. 8 years of captivity had taught her to distrust promises and hope, to expect disappointment and pain from situations that adults described as positive. The hospital's conference room had been arranged with comfortable chairs and soft lighting, designed to be as non-threatening as possible. Child psychologists would be present to monitor the situation and intervene if the encounter became too overwhelming for anyone involved. Social workers had prepared Maria for the possibility that this reunion might not be the joyful homecoming that popular culture often portrayed, that trauma could create barriers between family members that would take time and professional help to overcome. When Maria Rodriguez entered the room and saw the girl sitting hunched in a chair by the window, she knew immediately that this was her granddaughter. The face was older, marked by experiences that no grandmother wants to imagine, but it was unmistakably Emma. The eyes were the same, even though they now held wariness instead of the innocent curiosity that Maria remembered. The way she traced the crescent-shaped birthmark on her wrist when she was nervous was exactly the same habit she had shown as a 7-year-old. "Emma," Maria said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mija, it's me. It's Abuela." The girl looked up, and for a moment something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or just the memory of a time when her name had been Emma and she had been loved unconditionally by a woman who made strawberry jam and worried about spelling tests. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the protective blankness that had become her default expression. 8 years of separation had ended, but the journey toward healing was just beginning. The DNA results that arrived 3 days later confirmed what Maria Rodriguez had known the moment she saw the girl in the hospital room. This was Emma, her granddaughter, who had been 7 years old when she disappeared from Cedar Falls and was now 15, marked by 8 years of experiences that would take much longer to understand and heal. The clinical language of the forensic report: 99. 97% probability of familial relationship could not capture the weight of this confirmation, the simultaneous relief and heartbreak of a family reunited under circumstances that no one could have anticipated. Emma's physical condition, while concerning, was better than the medical team had initially feared. She was underweight and showed signs of chronic stress, but there were no life-threatening injuries or illnesses. The psychological evaluation was more complex and troubling. 8 years of captivity had left her with severe trauma that manifested in hypervigilance, difficulty trusting adults, and periods of dissociation where she seemed to retreat completely into herself. She spoke rarely and in whispers, as if she had learned that drawing attention to herself was dangerous. The investigation into her captivity was being handled by a joint task force that included the FBI, Minneapolis Police, Iowa State Police, and various social service agencies. The house where she had been found was part of a larger network that authorities were still mapping, a criminal enterprise that had operated across multiple states and involved the exploitation of numerous children over many years. Emma was one of several victims who had been recovered, though she appeared to have been held longer than most of the others. Dr. Sarah Kim, the child psychologist assigned to Emma's case, had worked with recovered children before, but she had never encountered someone who had been missing for such an extended period during such crucial developmental years. Emma had been 7 when she disappeared, still a child in every sense, dependent on adults for safety and guidance. She was now 15, biologically an adolescent, but psychologically frozen in ways that would require careful and patient therapeutic work to address. The reunion with her grandmother had been both heartbreaking and hopeful. Maria had wanted to hold Emma, to comfort her the way she had when Emma was small and afraid, but the girl flinched away from physical contact, her body rigid with the expectation of pain. They sat instead in the hospital room, Maria talking softly about memories from Emma's childhood, the ducks they used to feed in the park, the strawberry jam she always wanted on her toast, the stories they would read together before bedtime. Some of these memories seemed to reach Emma, bringing brief flickers of recognition to her eyes, but they were quickly replaced by the guarded expression she had learned to wear like armor. Dr. Kim explained that this was normal, that children who had been held in captivity often struggled to reconnect with their previous lives, that the process of reclaiming identity and relationships was gradual and couldn't be rushed. Isabella arrived from Portland within 24 hours of being notified about Emma's recovery. The reunion between mother and daughter was even more difficult than the one with Maria. Emma had been 7 when Isabella had been struggling with depression and financial instability, when their relationship had been strained by circumstances beyond either of their control. Now, 8 years later, they were strangers, connected by biology and separated by trauma that Isabella couldn't fully comprehend. Isabella had changed too during the years Emma had been missing. The grief and guilt of losing her daughter had motivated her to get sober, to find steady work, to create the stable life she had been unable to provide when Emma was young. But sitting in the hospital room, looking at the teenager who had once been her little girl, Isabella realized that all of her preparation and good intentions might not be enough to bridge the gap that 8 years of separation had created. The media attention surrounding Emma's recovery was intense and largely unwelcome. News outlets from across the country wanted to interview the family, to tell the story of the miracle reunion, to focus on the positive aspects of a child who had been found alive after years of being missing. But the reality was more complicated than the headlines suggested. Emma had been found, but she had not been rescued in any meaningful sense. She was physically free but psychologically imprisoned by experiences that would take years to process and overcome. Detective Chen coordinated with Minneapolis authorities to manage the flow of information to the press while protecting Emma's privacy and the integrity of the ongoing investigation. The details of Emma's captivity were not released to the public, both to protect her dignity and to avoid compromising the prosecution of the people responsible for her imprisonment. The focus remained on her medical care, and the beginning of what everyone understood would be a long process of rehabilitation and healing. Social services had to make difficult decisions about Emma's placement and care. While her family wanted her to come home immediately, child welfare experts recommended a gradual transition that would allow her to adjust slowly to the idea of freedom and family. Emma was placed in a specialized residential facility that worked with recovered trafficking victims, a place where she could receive intensive therapy while beginning to reconnect with her family in carefully supervised visits. The facility, called Haven House, was located in a quiet suburb of Minneapolis, surrounded by gardens and designed to feel more like a home than an institution. Emma was given her own room, the first private space she had controlled in 8 years, and was allowed to decorate it however she chose. For weeks, she left it completely bare, sitting on the bed and staring out the window as if she couldn't quite believe that this space belonged to her. Maria visited every day, making the 3-hour drive from Cedar Falls with the dedication of someone making up for lost time. She brought photographs from Emma's childhood, small mementos from the house on Maple Avenue, stories about the community that had never stopped looking for her. Sometimes Emma would listen with what seemed like interest, her fingers automatically tracing the crescent-shaped birthmark that had ultimately led to her identification. Other times, she would retreat so completely into herself that Maria wondered if she was even present in the room. The therapeutic work was slow and often frustrating. Dr. Kim used techniques specifically designed for trauma recovery, but Emma's case was complicated by the fact that her captivity had occurred during crucial developmental years. She had missed elementary school, middle school, the normal social interactions that help children learn to trust and connect with others. Her education had been non-existent, leaving her unable to read at grade level and unfamiliar with cultural references that most teenagers took for granted. But there were small victories that gave everyone hope. One afternoon, Maria brought a jar of strawberry jam from the same brand they had used when Emma was 7. She spread it on a piece of toast and offered it to her granddaughter, not expecting much response. But Emma took a small bite, and for the first time since her recovery, something like a smile crossed her face. It was brief and quickly suppressed, but it was genuine. A connection to a time when toast with strawberry jam had been the beginning of an ordinary day filled with ordinary love. Isabella struggled with her own guilt and confusion about how to reconnect with a daughter who had been through experiences she couldn't imagine. She had spent 8 years grieving for a 7-year-old who would never grow up, and now she was faced with a 15-year-old whose childhood had been stolen in ways that made Isabella's own struggles seem insignificant. The mother-daughter relationship would have to be built almost from scratch, complicated by Emma's trauma and Isabella's own feelings of inadequacy. The investigation continued to unfold, revealing a network of criminals who had been operating across multiple states for years. Emma's case had broken open a much larger conspiracy, one that had victimized dozens of children and involved people in positions of trust and authority. The FBI was careful not to share details with the family that might re-traumatize Emma, but it was clear that her recovery was part of a much larger effort to bring justice to children who had been exploited and abused. Cedar Falls had been following Emma's recovery through carefully managed media reports and updates from Detective Chen. The community that had searched for her, prayed for her, and never forgotten her, was overjoyed that she had been found alive, but also sobered by the understanding that her return would not be the simple homecoming they had imagined. Plans for a public celebration were quietly shelved as people began to understand that Emma's healing would require privacy and time rather than community attention. 3 months after her recovery, Emma spoke her first complete sentence to her grandmother. They were sitting in the garden at Haven House, watching birds at a feeder that reminded Emma of the ducks they used to visit in the park. "Do you still live in the same house?" she asked, her voice barely audible but clear. It was the first time she had acknowledged any connection to her life before captivity, the first indication that she might be ready to begin the long journey home. Maria's eyes filled with tears as she answered, "Yes, Mija. Your room is exactly the way you left it." "The unicorn drawing is still on the wall." Emma nodded slowly, processing this information with the careful consideration of someone who had learned not to trust promises about the future. But she didn't retreat into silence, and when Maria reached out slowly to touch her hand, Emma didn't pull away. 6 months later, Emma was ready for supervised visits to Cedar Falls, carefully planned day trips that would allow her to see her childhood home and community while returning to the safety of Haven House each evening. The first visit was overwhelming. The house on Maple Avenue looked exactly as she remembered it, down to the kitchen table where she used to eat breakfast and worry about spelling tests. Her bedroom was preserved like a shrine to the 7-year-old she had been, filled with toys and books that now seemed impossibly young. But it was also strangely comforting to see that some things had remained constant while her world had been completely transformed. Maria still made the same kind of toast, still tended the same garden, still moved through the house with the gentle efficiency that Emma remembered from before. These continuities provided anchors in a world that often felt too large and unpredictable for someone who had spent 8 years in captivity. The healing process would take years, Dr. Kim explained to the family. Emma would need ongoing therapy, educational support to catch up on missed schooling, and the kind of patient, unconditional love that could help her rebuild trust in relationships and hope for the future. There would be setbacks and breakthroughs, good days and terrible ones, moments of connection and periods of retreat. But she was alive, she was safe, and she was slowly beginning to remember that she had once been a little girl named Emma Rodriguez, who traced a crescent-shaped birthmark when she was thinking, who loved strawberry jam and worried about spelling tests, who had been loved completely by a grandmother who never stopped believing she would come home. The decision for Emma to move back to Cedar Falls was made gradually, over the course of nearly a year of carefully supervised visits and extensive consultation with her therapeutic team. By her 16th birthday, a milestone marked quietly at Haven House with a small cake and gifts from family, Emma had demonstrated enough stability and progress to attempt the transition back to her hometown. The move was planned with the same methodical care that had characterized every aspect of her recovery, with safeguards and support systems built in to protect against the setbacks that everyone understood were possible. The house on Maple Avenue had been subtly modified to accommodate Emma's needs. Her childhood bedroom remained unchanged, preserved exactly as it had been when she was 7, but a second room had been converted into a teen-appropriate space where she could retreat when the memories became too intense. Dr. Kim had recommended this approach, allowing Emma to choose each day whether she wanted to connect with her childhood self or her current identity, without forcing either choice upon her. Isabella had moved back to Cedar Falls 6 months earlier, renting a small apartment downtown and finding work at the local hospital as a desk clerk. The transition had been difficult for her as well. Returning to the place where she had lost her daughter 8 years earlier brought back all the guilt and grief she had spent years learning to manage, but she was determined to be present for Emma's recovery in a way she hadn't been able to be present during her childhood. The relationship between mother and daughter remained fragile and complicated. Emma seemed more comfortable with her grandmother, perhaps because Maria represented the safety and stability she remembered from before her captivity, while Isabella reminded her of a more chaotic time when her family had been struggling. Dr. Kim worked with both of them to build new patterns of interaction, helping Isabella understand that Emma's wariness wasn't personal, but rather a protective mechanism she had developed during years of trauma. Cedar Falls as a community had struggled with how to welcome Emma home without overwhelming her or turning her recovery into a public spectacle. The town that had searched for her so desperately 8 years earlier now found itself in the unexpected position of needing to give her space and privacy to heal. Local businesses quietly removed the missing child posters that had become part of the landscape, and residents made conscious efforts to treat Emma as normally as possible when they encountered her in public. The local high school had worked with state education officials to develop a specialized program that would allow Emma to complete her education at her own pace, with extensive support for both academic and social challenges. She had missed 8 years of formal schooling, but intelligence testing revealed that her cognitive abilities were intact despite the trauma she had endured. The challenge would be helping her catch up academically while also learning to navigate the complex social environment of teenage life. Emma's first day at Cedar Falls High School was carefully orchestrated to minimize stress and avoid unwanted attention. She attended only morning classes initially, with a modified schedule that allowed her to leave before lunch when the hallways became crowded and chaotic. Her teachers had been briefed on her situation and trained in trauma-informed education techniques, understanding that traditional disciplinary measures and academic pressures would need to be adjusted for someone with her unique history. The other students' reactions were mixed and largely respectful. Some remembered Emma from elementary school, though 8 years had changed everyone enough that recognition wasn't always immediate. Others knew her story from media coverage and were curious but understood that she needed space and privacy. A few appointed themselves as informal protectors, making sure she wasn't bothered by reporters or gawkers who occasionally showed up hoping to catch a glimpse of the miracle survivor. Emma herself struggled with the overwhelming sensory input of a normal high school environment. The sounds of lockers slamming, announcements over the intercom, and hundreds of teenagers talking and laughing were jarring after years of enforced quiet. She often wore noise-cancelling headphones between classes and had permission to leave any situation that became too overwhelming. Her teachers quickly learned to recognize the signs that she was approaching her limits and needed a break. But there were positive moments as well. In art class, Emma discovered that drawing helped her process emotions she couldn't yet put into words. Her sketches were often dark and troubling, but her teacher, Mrs. Williams, recognized them as an important part of her healing process. She encouraged Emma to keep a visual journal, explaining that sometimes images could communicate what words couldn't, that art had been helping people work through trauma for thousands of years. Mathematics, surprisingly, became Emma's strongest subject. Numbers didn't require the kind of social understanding or cultural knowledge that she had missed during her captivity. They followed logical rules that made sense, providing a kind of certainty that was absent from most other areas of her life. Her algebra teacher, Mr. Thompson, noticed her natural aptitude and began giving her advanced problems that challenged her intellect without requiring the interpersonal skills that still felt dangerous to her. The criminal trials related to Emma's case were ongoing, creating additional stress for her and her family. Prosecutors were careful to minimize Emma's involvement in the proceedings, using other evidence and testimony whenever possible, but her cooperation was sometimes necessary to ensure that the people responsible for her captivity were held accountable. These court appearances were traumatic, requiring extensive preparation and support, but Emma understood their importance in preventing other children from experiencing what she had endured. Dr. Kim continued to work with Emma through weekly therapy sessions, helping her process not only the trauma of her captivity, but also the complex emotions surrounding her return to normal life. Freedom, it turned out, could be as overwhelming as imprisonment in its own way. Emma struggled with decision-making, having spent years in an environment where choices were either non-existent or dangerous. Simple decisions like what to wear or what to eat for lunch sometimes paralyzed her with anxiety. The nightmares remained frequent and intense, often waking Emma in the early hours of the morning with her heart racing and her body covered in sweat. Maria would hear her moving around the house and would get up to sit with her, not saying much but providing the kind of steady presence that helped Emma remember where she was and that she was safe. These middle-of-the-night vigils became an important part of their relationship, quiet hours when Emma sometimes felt comfortable enough to share small pieces of her experience. Spring arrived in Cedar Falls with its usual promise of renewal, and Emma found herself drawn to her grandmother's garden in ways she hadn't expected. Working with her hands in the soil, planting seeds and tending to growing things provided a kind of therapeutic activity that complemented her formal therapy sessions. Maria taught her the names of flowers and vegetables, shared family stories about relatives who had been gardeners, helped her understand that growth was often slow and imperceptible, but ultimately transformative. One afternoon in late May, while they were working together to plant tomatoes, Emma began talking about what she remembered from the morning she had disappeared. The memories were fragmented and often contradictory, filtered through the perspective of a 7-year-old and distorted by years of trauma, but they provided important pieces of information for both the ongoing investigation and Emma's own understanding of what had happened to her. She remembered walking to school as usual, remembered seeing the familiar houses and landmarks along the route she had taken hundreds of times before. But somewhere between her grandmother's house and the school entrance, someone had approached her. She couldn't remember who or exactly how it had happened, but she remembered feeling confused and then afraid, and then nothing, until she woke up in a place that would become her prison for the next 8 years. The conversation was difficult for both of them, but it also represented an important breakthrough in Emma's recovery. For the first time, she was able to connect her current self with the 7-year-old who had disappeared, to acknowledge that both versions of herself were real and valid. Dr. Kim explained that this integration of identity was crucial for trauma survivors, that healing required accepting all parts of one's experience rather than trying to forget or deny them. As Emma's 17th birthday approached, her family began planning a small celebration that would acknowledge both how far she had come and how much healing remained ahead. The contrast with her 7th birthday, which had been spent in captivity under circumstances no one wanted to imagine, was both heartbreaking and hopeful. 8 years had been stolen from her, but she was alive, she was safe, and she was slowly learning to trust that the future might hold possibilities she couldn't yet imagine. The crescent-shaped birthmark on her wrist remained as distinctive as ever, the mark that had ultimately led to her identification and rescue. But Emma had begun to see it differently, not just as a physical characteristic, but as a symbol of her survival, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, some things remain constant and identifiable. When she traced it with her finger now, as she still did when she was thinking, it connected her to the 7-year-old who had loved strawberry jam and worried about spelling tests, but also to the 16-year-old who was learning to rebuild her life one day at a time. 2 years after Emma's return to Cedar Falls, life had settled into routines that were both normal and carefully structured around her ongoing recovery. She was 18 now, had earned her high school diploma through the specialized program, and was cautiously considering college applications with the support of her family and therapeutic team. The nightmares had become less frequent, though they hadn't disappeared entirely, and she had developed coping strategies that allowed her to function in social situations that would have been impossible just a year earlier. It was during this period of relative stability that Detective Chen received a phone call that would reopen aspects of Emma's case that everyone had assumed were permanently closed. The caller was Agent Michael Torres, the FBI investigator who had coordinated Emma's recovery, and his voice carried the weight of information that no one had expected to uncover. "Sarah," he said, using the informal address that had developed during their years of working together, "we need to talk about Emma Rodriguez. Something has come to light that changes everything we thought we knew about her disappearance." The meeting took place at the Cedar Falls Police Department, in the same conference room where Emma's case had been coordinated 8 years earlier. Present were Detective Chen, Agent Torres, Maria Rodriguez, and Emma herself, now old enough to participate in discussions about her own case and determined to understand every aspect of what had happened to her. Isabella was traveling for work, but would be briefed separately. Agent Torres began by explaining that the ongoing prosecution of the criminal network responsible for Emma's captivity had led to the discovery of extensive records, including detailed logs of victims, locations, and operations dating back more than a decade. Among these records were files specifically related to Emma's case, documenting not only her 8 years in captivity, but also the circumstances of her initial abduction. "What we've learned," Torres said carefully, "is that Emma wasn't taken by strangers who happened to be passing through Cedar Falls. Her abduction was specifically planned and carried out by people who had been watching her family for months." The revelation was stunning in its implications. Emma's disappearance hadn't been a random crime of opportunity, as investigators had always assumed, but rather a targeted operation carried out by criminals who had identified her as a specific victim. The case files revealed surveillance photos of Emma walking to school, detailed notes about her daily routines, and planning documents that mapped out the timing and logistics of her abduction. Even more disturbing was the discovery that the criminal network had been operating in Iowa for years before Emma's disappearance, using detailed intelligence about local families, school schedules, and community patterns to identify and target vulnerable children. Emma had been chosen not because she was particularly vulnerable, but because her routine was predictable, and her family situation, living with her grandmother while her mother struggled with personal issues, suggested that any immediate response to her disappearance might be delayed or confused. "The person who approached Emma that morning wasn't a stranger," Torres continued, consulting the files spread across the conference table. "It was someone she had been taught to trust, someone who had been positioned specifically to gain her confidence. The details, when they emerged, were almost too painful to comprehend. A woman had been hired to work as a substitute teacher at Cedar Falls Elementary, using false credentials and a manufactured background that had passed the school district's routine screening. She had worked at the school for several weeks before Emma's disappearance, long enough to become a familiar face to students and staff, long enough for Emma to recognize her as someone who belonged in her world. On the morning of October 15, 2013, this woman had approached Emma near the school entrance with a story about needing to speak with her privately about her grandmother, who had supposedly been in an accident. Emma, trusting an adult she recognized from school, had followed her away from the building and into a vehicle where other members of the criminal network were waiting. By the time Mrs. Patterson had marked Emma absent from class, she was already hundreds of miles away from Cedar Falls. The substitute teacher had disappeared from Cedar Falls immediately after Emma's abduction, her false identity carefully dismantled, her trail obscured by the sophisticated operational security that had allowed the criminal network to operate across multiple states for years. Local authorities had investigated every staff member at the school, but their background checks had found nothing suspicious about a woman whose credentials, while false, had been expertly fabricated. Emma listened to these revelations with a composure that impressed everyone in the room, though Detective Chen could see the emotional toll they were taking. For 10 years, Emma had lived with fragmented memories of her abduction, uncertain about details that her 7-year-old mind hadn't been able to process completely. Now at 18, she was learning that her trust had been specifically and deliberately exploited by people who had planned her victimization with clinical precision. "I remember her," Emma said quietly when Torres finished his presentation. "Mrs. Anderson, she said her name was. She had a nice voice and she always smiled when she saw me in the hallway. She told me my grandmother was hurt and needed to see me right away." The false name was confirmed in the criminal network's files, along with the psychological profile they had developed of Emma as a target. She had been chosen partly because she was polite and well-behaved, likely to trust adult authority figures, and partly because her family situation suggested that her disappearance might initially be attributed to custody issues or family dysfunction rather than criminal abduction. Maria Rodriguez absorbed this information with a combination of rage and grief that was difficult to witness. For 8 years, she had blamed herself for not walking Emma all the way into the school building, for trusting that the 4 blocks between her house and the school entrance were safe. Now she was learning that no amount of caution would have prevented Emma's abduction, that it had been planned by people who had studied their routines and identified their vulnerabilities with professional thoroughness. The network had files on dozens of families in small towns across the Midwest, Torres explained. They specifically targeted communities like Cedar Falls because law enforcement resources were limited and because people trusted each other in ways that could be exploited. Emma's case was part of a much larger operation that we're still working to fully understand. The criminal network had been methodical in their approach, using legitimate businesses as fronts, establishing people in positions of trust within communities, and maintaining detailed intelligence on potential victims and their families. Emma's abduction had been just one operation among many, carried out by people who had turned the exploitation of children into a sophisticated business enterprise. For Emma, these revelations provided a kind of closure that she hadn't expected to find. The fragmented memories of her abduction finally made sense when placed in the context of a planned operation, rather than a random crime. The woman who had lured her away from school hadn't been a stranger who had happened to notice a vulnerable child, but rather a professional criminal who had been specifically positioned to gain her trust. "It wasn't your fault," Detective Chen said to both Emma and Maria, understanding that this was information they both needed to hear explicitly. "None of this was your fault. These people were professionals who spent months planning Emma's abduction. They would have found a way to take her regardless of what precautions you had taken." The meeting concluded with discussions about the ongoing prosecution and the possibility that Emma's testimony might be needed in additional trials. But for Emma, the most important outcome was the understanding that her abduction hadn't been the result of any failure on her part or her family's part. She had been targeted by criminals who had studied her life and exploited her natural trust in adults, particularly those in positions of authority. Walking home from the police station with her grandmother, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced since her recovery, a sense of completion. The question that had haunted her for years, how could she have been so stupid as to follow a stranger, had finally been answered. She hadn't followed a stranger. She had followed someone who had been carefully positioned to seem trustworthy, someone who had exploited the natural trust that children place in adults who are supposed to protect them. The crescent-shaped birthmark on her wrist had led to her identification and rescue, but it was this final piece of information about her abduction that allowed her to truly begin the process of forgiving herself for being a 7-year-old who had trusted the wrong person at the wrong time. The healing that had begun in a Minneapolis hospital room would continue for years to come, but it could now proceed without the burden of misplaced guilt that had complicated her recovery. As they walked through downtown Cedar Falls, passing the same streets where Emma had been a missing child whose photograph appeared on every bulletin board and storefront window, both women understood that they were finally free to move forward. The mystery of what had happened to Emma Rodriguez had been solved completely, and while the truth was more disturbing than anyone had imagined, it was also liberating in its clarity. Sometimes the most important discoveries aren't about finding something new, but about understanding something that has always been there, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. 5 years had passed since the final revelations about Emma's abduction, and Cedar Falls had quietly settled into a new understanding of itself as a community that had survived one of its worst nightmares and emerged stronger for the experience. Emma Rodriguez, now 23 years old, had graduated from the University of Iowa with a degree in social work, a choice that surprised no one who had watched her transformation from a traumatized teenager into a young woman determined to help other survivors of childhood trauma. She lived in a small apartment near the campus in Iowa City, but she returned to Cedar Falls regularly to visit her grandmother and to work with the non-profit organization she had helped establish 3 years earlier. The Emma Rodriguez Foundation provided support and resources for families of missing children, focusing particularly on the long-term assistance needed when children were recovered after extended periods of captivity. It was work that grew directly from her own experience, but also from her recognition that her family had been fortunate to have resources and support that many other families lacked. Maria Rodriguez, now in her 70s, remained the steady presence she had always been. Though the years of stress and worry had taken their toll, she still worked part-time at Murphy's Diner, still tended her garden with the dedication of someone who understood that growth required patience and consistent care. Her relationship with Emma had deepened into something that transcended the grandmother-granddaughter bond they had shared when Emma was a child. They were now 2 women who had survived trauma together and had learned to build something meaningful from the wreckage of their worst fears. Isabella had married a man she met in therapy, someone who understood the complexities of healing from family trauma, and they lived in Des Moines, where she worked as a victim advocate for the State Attorney General's office. Her relationship with Emma had never fully recovered the easy intimacy they had shared when Emma was very young, but it had evolved into something different and perhaps more honest, a connection between 2 adults who had both survived difficult experiences and could support each other without pretending that the past hadn't happened. The criminal network responsible for Emma's abduction had been thoroughly dismantled, with dozens of arrests and convictions resulting from the investigation that her recovery had triggered. Emma had testified in several trials, experiences that were difficult but also empowering in their own way. She had learned that her voice as a survivor carried weight, that her willingness to speak about her experiences could help ensure that the people responsible for her suffering and the suffering of other children were held accountable. Dr. Kim, who had guided Emma through her initial recovery, remained part of her support network, though their sessions were now monthly rather than weekly and focused more on life planning than trauma processing. The therapeutic work would never be completely finished. Trauma left permanent changes that required ongoing management, but Emma had developed the skills and support systems necessary to live a full and meaningful life despite her experiences. The house on Maple Avenue had evolved as well. Emma's childhood bedroom remained preserved, but it was now more museum than shrine, a place where family members could go to remember the little girl who had loved strawberry jam and worried about spelling tests. The house itself had become a gathering place for the extended community of families that had formed around the Foundation's work, a space where people who understood the particular challenges of surviving child abduction could find support and understanding. Emma's romantic life had been slow to develop, complicated by trust issues and the challenge of finding someone who could understand her experiences without being overwhelmed by them. But during her senior year of college, she had met David, a graduate student in psychology who was researching childhood resilience. Their relationship had developed gradually, built on friendship and mutual respect, before evolving into something deeper. He understood that there were parts of Emma's experience that she might never be able to share completely, and he respected her need for boundaries and control in their relationship. The work with the Foundation had led Emma to other survivors, other families, other communities dealing with the aftermath of crimes against children. She had learned that her experience, while unique in its details, was part of a larger pattern of trauma and recovery that affected thousands of families across the country. This understanding had been both sobering and empowering, connecting her to a community of survivors who understood each other in ways that people who hadn't experienced similar trauma couldn't fully comprehend. On a warm Tuesday in October, 15 years to the day after her disappearance, Emma stood in the memorial garden at Cedar Falls Elementary, which had been expanded over the years to honor not just her, but all missing children from the area. Students who had been born years after her abduction walked past on their way to classes, most of them unaware of the significance of the date or the woman standing quietly among the flowers their predecessors had planted in memory of a classmate they had never expected to see again. The crescent-shaped birthmark on her wrist was still clearly visible, still the distinguishing characteristic that had led to her identification and rescue 8 years earlier. But Emma no longer traced it compulsively when she was thinking. Instead, it had become simply part of her, like a scar that told a story without defining the person who carried it. She wore it without shame or constant awareness, the way people wear evidence of any experience that has shaped them without overwhelming them. Maria joined her in the garden, moving with the careful steps of someone whose body carried the accumulated weight of many years and considerable worry. They stood together without speaking for several minutes, two women who had shared an experience that had changed them both, in ways they were still discovering. The silence was comfortable, the kind of quiet that comes from deep understanding, rather than the absence of things to say. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had walked you all the way into the building that morning?" Maria asked, voicing a question that had haunted her for 15 years, despite all the therapy and all the rational explanations about professional criminals and planned operations. Emma considered the question seriously, as she always did when her grandmother asked about the what-ifs that continued to trouble her. "I think they would have found another way," she said finally. "Or they would have waited for a different opportunity, or they would have chosen a different child." She paused, watching elementary students play on equipment that hadn't existed when she was their age. "What I know now is that thinking about what might have been different doesn't change what actually happened. And what actually happened, as terrible as it was, led to all of this." She gestured toward the memorial garden, toward the school where teachers had been trained in trauma-informed education techniques that helped them recognize and support students who had experienced abuse or neglect, toward the community that had learned to balance vigilance with trust in ways that protected children, without destroying the openness that made small towns livable. It led to the foundation, to the families we've been able to help, to the children who are safer because people learned from what happened to me, Emma continued. I'm not grateful that I was abducted. I wouldn't wish that experience on anyone. But I'm grateful for what I've been able to do with my survival. As they walked back toward Maria's house, past the same streets where Emma had once been a missing child, whose disappearance had shattered a community's sense of security, both women understood that they had arrived at something that resembled peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from forgetting trauma or pretending it didn't happen, but the deeper peace that comes from integrating difficult experiences into a life that has meaning and purpose beyond survival. Emma would continue to work with other survivors, to speak at conferences and training sessions where her story could help professionals better understand the long-term needs of recovered children. She would marry David in a small ceremony in Maria's garden, surrounded by people who had supported her recovery and who understood that happy endings were often more complicated and more meaningful than fairy tales suggested. The house on Maple Avenue would remain in the family, eventually becoming the headquarters for the Foundation's expanded programming. Emma's childhood bedroom would be converted into an office, though the unicorn drawing would remain on the wall as a reminder that some things are worth preserving even as life moves forward in unexpected directions. And on quiet Tuesday mornings, when the light fell through the kitchen window in ways that reminded her of breakfast conversations about spelling tests and strawberry jam, Emma would sometimes trace the crescent-shaped birthmark on her wrist and remember that she had once been a 7-year-old girl who believed that adults could be trusted and that the world was essentially safe. That belief had been shattered and then slowly rebuilt, not as naive optimism, but as informed hope. The understanding that terrible things happen, but that people can survive them and help others do the same. If stories like Emma's move you to believe in the power of hope and the strength of human connection, we share them because they remind us that even in our darkest moments, the melodies of love continue to play, waiting to guide us home. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear more stories that touch the soul and inspire the heart. Because sometimes the most important discoveries aren't about finding something new, but about understanding that healing is possible even after the deepest wounds, and that the crescent moons on our wrists, whatever form they take, can become symbols not of what was lost, but of what was found again.